Howdy, howdy, howdy. It's time for Collection Connection, the game that's just an excuse to talk about records. Last Tuesday, over on the Plastic Soundwave Cult channel, my brother Plastic Eric showed a record from his collection, and that record was Meantime, the 1992 sophomore album of metal-flavored hard rock from Helmet. Certainly I'd heard of the band, but I couldn't have named an album or hummed a tune from them, so this is basically brand new to me. I'll give you my impressions of it after a handful of spins, and then connect it to a seemingly unrelated album from my own collection that has something in common with it. Actually, a couple of things in common, because I discovered that each album is arguably the major label debut for both bands, but that is not the connection. The album I've connected it to is our fourth in a row from the 1990s. From 1997, it is the penultimate release from the alternative trio Morphine, and it's called Like Swimming. The challenge for you is to identify the common ground they share from the information given over the course of the video, and then put that guess in the comments, along with any conversation you want to have about the bands or albums featured. The first correct answer will receive a shout out in my brother's next video. But first, let's officially reveal the connection between the prior pair of albums, those being Cardigan's Life album and Helmet's Meantime. And the connection is that both bands are named for, or share names with, articles of clothing. That was a little sneaky one, but it was successfully guessed by Murdoch over at Murdoch's Music Minute. And you can tune in to his latest video where he reacts to the new single from Doves, a band that I have a long history with as well. So that was interesting to hear a new track from them. But yeah, that's over on Murdoch's Music Minute. That's the latest thing over there. And with all that business taken care of, let's get on with the show. Alright, so as I mentioned, Eric talked about Helmet's Meantime. Helmet is a band that I probably threw into the grunge basket back in the 90s as something that's sort of predetermined that I wasn't necessarily interested in listening to, but playing the album, I spun through it a few times with our little more relaxed timeline we have going now. I got a chance to listen to it 3 times, and it still remains not necessarily something that is my type of music, but it is not as objectionable to me as some of that metal or grunge or stuff from that era can be. It started off with a couple of tracks where there's more scream singing, but even then it wasn't like Cookie Monster vocals, and it wasn't histrionics. It was just kind of a screamy vocal, more kind of like a gravelly scream. But by like track 3, the vocals, which I understand are all the same guys still singing, became much more of a low register and sounded to me very much like Ozzy. And so the music overall struck me as like hard rock. It was very clean, especially in the backing track, but the whole thing felt pretty slickly produced, made me feel like Soundgarden or Stone Temple Pilots or something like that, and very groove based. So it's really not the heaviness of that kind of music that turns me off. Generally, I wouldn't listen to an album's worth of it, but yeah, I don't object to, big heavy chords and guitar playing. It's really the vocals are the make or break for me on something like this, and the fact that it wasn't really grunge, that it was pretty clean and produced, and struck me more as hard rock than even heavy metal. I thought it wasn't bad, for what it was, for not being my kind of thing. It was a good version of not my kind of thing. I didn't have a problem listening to it the 3 times. And so I would say, yeah, it's a new one on me. Helmet, not what I had preconceived them to be. And so, pleasant surprise, nothing I would pursue. But yeah, there you go. Helmet, Meantime. And I connected it to Like Swimming from Morphine. Interestingly, this is an album that my brother, Plastic Eric, the very same, gave to me. He gave me this and Cure for Pain at the same time. Like Swimming was their debut for DreamWorks Records, and they had been on a couple labels before this, most notably Rykodisc, which is what Cure for Pain was released on. I don't know, I read this described as their major label debut for DreamWorks, and yet I don't know that I think of DreamWorks as being a bigger label than Rykodisc. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but it feels like I got a lot more titles on Ryko, who maybe are more known for reissues than new music. Ryko and Rhino reissued a ton of stuff during the 90s, I feel like, especially. So yeah, I don't know that I would call it their major label debut, but that's kind of how it was described in the stuff that I read. As I mentioned, Eric bought it for me, and I have a very contrarian bone in my body somewhere that when somebody approaches me with something new and says, hey, I think you would like this, there's part of me that is a little bit like, oh yeah, you think so? Well, let's see if it impresses me. And I don't know that it did super impress me. And this album, Like Swimming, is not one that Eric has. I think that he was feeling out, I had given him some stuff, and he likes to keep the scales fairly even, so he wanted to get me something, and he thought Morphine would be it. And I was familiar with this album's Early to Bed, was a song that I had been hearing, and I thought, hey, it's not bad. And so I think that he got me Cure for Pain and this one, even though the two that he has are Cure for Pain and an earlier album called Yes, I Believe, or Good. He's got one of those two. And so I would be lying if I said that I had given it a lot of spins over the course of time. This is definitely one that I pulled out, from not the recesses, it was right there behind me on the wall, but one that I hadn't pulled out in a long time. Listening to it now with sort of less of that contrarian ideology, I could see why he would think that I would like it, and it is good. It makes me think of Cake in that this is a trio, or was a trio. They put out a handful of records in the 90s, and they had a drummer and a saxophone player and a bassist. So their sound was very different, and I think it's fair to say that they were an alternative act, but more in the 80s sense of alternative. It feels like the alternative sound was sort of codified by the 90s, and this didn't fit into that sound, and yet it did not fit into the mainstream either. Almost the flip side of the Cardigans that I talked about last week, which were sort of very upper register. This is very low register. It's all kind of low end. And so, interesting contrast with the Cardigans, but yeah, it gives them a very unique sound, getting away from the, saxophone solos that seemed like they were ubiquitous in the 80s and sort of killed the saxophone on record. The fact that this is one of the band members, and it was Dana Colley, I believe, on saxophone. They had disparate influences and took jazz, and I think Dana Colley had come from like a jazz type group, maybe a jazz fusion type group, but their sound was very different and inspired by things outside of pop and rock music. The singer, Mark Sandman, or Sandman, but I want to call it Sandman because it's the Sandman, had a very sort of relaxed voice, singing laid back, and it sounded sort of naturally sardonic, which is another thing that makes me think about Cake, so they had the prominent trumpet in Cake. So they had these wry lyrics that I'm sure were about topics, but I still haven't listened to it enough to really let it sink in. But he is at least one of these singers who it's very clear what he is singing, unlike The Helmet, where weirdly the only lyric I picked up was something about downtown Julie Brown, repeated in one of the songs, who was an MTV VJ in the 1990s. So the type of music that was didn't feel like they would be singing about downtown Julie Brown, the VJ, but that was the one thing I picked up in the lyrics over and over. By contrast, Mark Sandman's lyrics, his singing is very easy, to discern. The album, suffice to say, was a good record. I enjoyed it, and I'm going to have to dig up Cure for Pain again, which is, I think the album that my brother liked best. And give that a listen, because their sound is not, again, and this is 1997, but the mid 90s, including the 92, 93, basically everything post Nirvana, which would have included that Helmet album, was a real kind of low point for me. I was kind of tuned out musically. All of my favorite 80s acts had either broken up or stopped recording, and I was very out of touch with music for a while. I didn't like what was being played on the radio, didn't speak to me, so I just kind of pulled away and did my own thing then for a while, and didn't really find much new during that time period. So I'm not entirely sure what the point is I was making with all that, but Morphine was surprisingly good. Kicking myself a little bit for being so churlish about having something recommended to me and not really approaching it with an open heart. It's maybe a problem that I have in general, but I like to think that I've gotten better about it over time. I just haven't, played this album probably too often since I've had that change of heart, since I've matured a little bit. But in addition to Early to Bed, which was, again, the one song that I remembered, I Know You Part 3 was memorable. It comes right before Early to Bed, and it is a sequel. There's I Know You Part 1 and Part 2 that are from their debut album, Good. And Part 3 here, I Know You, kind of takes the tempo. For being quote unquote, sequels or whatever. The music is the same, but it kind of takes the lyrics from Part 2 and more of the tempo and arrangement from Part 1 and marries them into a song that's a little more full and with more lyrics and kind of more complete song. I did go back and listen to those two tracks just out of curiosity. Wishing Well. French Fries with Pepper was one that I did try to connect with, I remember, way back in the day. And weirdly was sort of less of a standout for me this time. Eric was saying 11 O'Clock was a good one. But yeah, overall, I think it's a better album than I would have given it credit for had I not pulled it out, and listened to it a few times recently. And so I would recommend. They were not a big band anywhere, really. This did as well as they did anywhere. I think Early to Bed, nothing you would classify as a hit single, but I think was their best performing single anywhere. And this seemed like a halfway decent place to start. I think they tended to show up maybe on a few soundtracks in the mid-90s because of being on DreamWorks. DreamWorks had the synergy of, releasing movies. So they would show up on soundtracks here or there. But yeah, surprisingly good. I'd be definitely interested in listening to them a little bit more. At least the two albums that I already own, so why not? But I would recommend, Like Swimming from Morphine. I think the album cover feels low effort to me. I'm not crazy about the album cover. Nothing that won me over. Felt kind of, this feels grungy to me, even though their sound is something entirely different. With that said, I've probably rambled on enough before my camera goes out of focus again. I will say, Eric, then next Tuesday, now that we're on a kind of one-off, one-on weekly schedule, every Tuesday we're putting out a new collection connection. So here's me today, and next week Eric will find something in his record collection to connect to Morphine's Like Swimming from 1997, and he will make a little video about it, and he will upload it next Tuesday. So look forward to that. This gives you a little more time to listen to the album, do a little research, and come up with an answer. And if you think you know what the connection is between Helmet's Meantime and Morphine's Like Swimming, you can put that down in the comments, and you will get, if you're right, a shout out in Eric's video on on Tuesday. I'll have to get that out of my vocabulary. I've been saying that for a few years, on Monday, but it's not. It's Tuesday. And with that, I think I've said everything I got to say, so I thank you for watching. Bye bye.